Welcome back to No Bolts Left Behind. I thought I'd get a little change of scenery, get out of the garage, and film this thing out here by the ocean, so hopefully it's not too loud. All right, let's get started. 11 months ago, I bought this 1968 Mustang, barely running on its original factory inline 6-cylinder. Drove it 100 miles back home from San Diego. My goal for this build was basically to do like an extreme budget garage build Restomod. Basically wanted it driving and looking nice with modern disc brakes, fuel injection, reliable, road trip ready. And for the first part of my build series, I went down sort of a rabbit hole trying to get the original inline 6-cylinder back up and running on fuel injection. And that turned out to be a pretty big mistake. About halfway through the build series, I decided instead to do an engine swap, and I bought a donor Ford Explorer for its 5.0 V8. So I'll go over what it cost me to get this thing back to good condition, looking good, and I'll go over what I spent trying to get the original 6-cylinder engine running again, and then I'll go over all of the costs involved in swapping that Ford Explorer 5.0. All right, so let's start with restoration. I spent $156 on exterior trim pieces. I spent $54 on a set of emblems. New door locks were $34. New door handles were $32. The window belt line felts were $123. All of the new glass seals and weather strips were $154. I bought a new dash pad for $201. A new set of seat belts were $141. The A-pillar pads were $66. A pair of sun visors were $71. A trunk liner was $48. And then I had a bunch of miscellaneous interior pieces. Those all added up to $156. I spent $30 on a backup camera. I spent $31 on the alarm and keyless entry system. The Bluetooth stereo setup, including the speakers and the amp, was $210. The front disc brake kit was $634. The kit to upgrade to power brakes was $314. Before I did the, oh, there's a boat going by. I had to buy a pair of original disc brake rims. Those were $100. I bought a complete set of LED bulbs for the car. That was $106. I bought a new heater valve for the car. That was $16. I was missing one of the two horns, so I bought the missing one for $29. I put all new brake lines and fittings. That was $225. And then lastly, all of the stuff to rebuild the front end, all of the bushings, control arms, tie rod ends, all of that stuff, that was $454. So that brings the grand total of what I would call like a restoration, or basically all the stuff to fix up the car and make it look nice. That was a total of $3,385. All right, so next let's go over all of the painful costs that I spent trying to get the factory inline 6-cylinder to work. Oh, and before I start, I should mention too that all of these costs include shipping and tax, so these should be pretty close to out-the-door prices. All right, so I bought a Holley Sniper fuel injection kit. That was $979. I bought an HEI distributor. That was $99. I bought a distributor wiring pigtail. That was $11. I bought a fresh set of spark plugs. That was $13. I bought an air cleaner. That was $46. I bought all new belts for that engine. That was $27. I bought new radiator hoses. Those were $26. I bought a new water pump. That was $37. I bought a new thermostat housing, $17. I bought new spark plug wires, $40. I had to buy a new head gasket, that was $59. I bought a rebuilt cylinder head, that was $200. My oil filter fluids, that was $40. And I had to buy a couple of new head bolts, those were $9. So the damage was $1,603. However, I did manage to resell a lot of that stuff, or pretty much all of that stuff, and recoup some of my expenses. I resold the Holley Sniper for $800. I got all $200 back for the cylinder head, so that one was a wash. I sold the HEI distributor for $40. I got 20 bucks back for the air cleaner, and 20 bucks back for the spark plug wires. So I managed to get back $1,080. So in reality, I wasted only $523 trying to rebuild that engine. I'll call that a good lesson learned, and I won't include that in the final cost of the project. All right, so now let's go over all of the costs of swapping the Ford Explorer 5.0 with the 4R70W transmission and the Explorer 8.8 axle into the Mustang. So I spent $207 on all of my battery cables and fuse block and relays and wiring sleeve, all of that kind of stuff. I spent $89 on a fuel pump. I spent $19 on a fuel filter. And I spent $318 on all of my fuel lines, all of my fuel fittings, my fuel AN lines, brackets, all that kind of stuff. I spent $111 on new engine belts and gaskets. I spent $161 on the engine mounts and V8 engine mount brackets. I spent $47 on an oil filter and fresh oil. I spent $26 on an engine temperature sensor. I spent $33 on an oil pressure sensor. I spent $109 on an oil pan, pickup tube, and gasket. I spent $140 on my sort of custom oil dipstick flange and dipstick tube. I spent $31 on fresh spark plugs. I spent $147 on my cold air intake, tubing, couplers, clamps, and air filter. The aluminum radiator and fan that I installed cost $725. I had to get a couple of V8 radiator brackets. Those were $108. Radiator paint was $33. And my radiator coolant overflow reservoir was $27. All right, that was mostly engine stuff, so now I'm gonna cover all of the parts I had to buy for the 8.8 differential swap. A pair of leaf spring perches were $65. I had to buy a brake line adapter for $14. Some fresh differential fluid was $48. A new brake proportioning valve for my now disc brake setup was $44. Differential cover gasket, $8. A fresh set of rear brake pads and rotors was $114. I bought 4 brand new wheels, those were $492. A brand new set of tires was $328. Then I had to pay $120 to have those tires mounted and balanced on the rims. All right, so let's go over all of the costs of swapping the 4R70W. The transmission crossmember and mount was $161. I spent $124 on new transmission fluid and a new transmission filter. I spent $70 on transmission, coolant lines, and fittings. I spent $10 on shift linkage heim joints. I spent $12 on a new speedometer cable. And the only cost that I paid for labor on this entire project was $140 to have my drive shaft shortened. I spent about $87 trying to fix my original power steering setup, which unfortunately ended up being a little bit of a sunk cost, because eventually I went ahead and bought a Borgeson power steering box. That costs $570. And then I spent $102 getting a high pressure power steering line made. All right, so the grand total for swapping a fuel injected 5.0 from a Ford Explorer into a 68 Mustang is $4,840. And of course I'm missing one huge piece of this puzzle, and that's the cost of the donor car, the 1996 Ford Explorer that I bought. So I actually bought that car for $1,650, which I think might be my cheapest donor car purchase to date. And when I buy a donor car, I end up stripping it completely out and selling every single part that I possibly can. And I ended up selling $1,500 worth of parts off of that thing, which means that I only spent $150 for my engine, transmission, drive shaft, rear axle, wiring harness, computer, pretty much an entire swap kit. Okay, so the moment of truth. So the combined cost of the restoration parts and all of the swap parts is $7,485. And if you're curious, I originally bought this car for $9,500. That means the grand total for the entire project is just under $17,000. All right, so that's it. That's the final damage. I used to hate keeping track of all the money I spent because of course it always adds up to way more than you thought it would. But now I realize it helps me quite a bit. I'm keeping my budgets under control and having a list to kind of go back and see what I can buy and sell things for. So hopefully this can help you on your own project, your own V8 swap, and probably any restoration you do in your own muscle car. All right, see you next time.